Good afternoon, esteemed professors, distinguished guests, colleagues, and students. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the UMFST Law Review Conference on the theme New World Order. And it is both my pleasure and my honor to serve as moderator for today's conference, which takes place here at the Faculty of Economics and Law. This event is organized by the Student Circle Lex Hub, and it brings together voices from different disciplines, law, journalism, and forensic investigation, to discuss how law responds to the major transformations and crises shaping the world today. The theme, New World Order, invites us to reflect on the realities we face: armed conflicts, migration crises, global instability, and the profound ways in which justice, human rights, and international law must evolve. Our goal today is to create a space where theory meets practice and where we can ask a central question: how can we build a fair, more humane, and more responsible international order? Before we begin the conference, I have the great honor of inviting several distinguished representatives of the University of Medicine, Pharmacy, Science and Technology of Târgu Mureș, George Emil Palade, of the Faculty of Law and Economics, and publishing partners to offer us a few welcoming words.
Dear colleagues, and of course, dear students, I would like to start by addressing thanks to those involved in this event, and knowing that their efforts, their dedication in what they are doing every day to keep the flag of the law review of their group Lex Hub up, and their time spent every day to create something beautiful as usual, and their involvement in this kind of activities. Thank you all for being here today. I hope that the new world order will start here and not in America now, because Trump is not invited to Târgu Mureș, but together, being so many, in place in Târgu Mureș or online, thank you for those present online, I'm sure that we can create a golden path, something that will be significant for the future, for you as students, and for us as faculty, and will remain something to be that we want to be proud for the next students that will come, and the creation of a good tradition in our faculty and in our university. So thank you again for everybody who is involved, was involved in this event, and many more for the future.
Hello everyone, welcome our distinguished guests, and I would like to say bravo, to congratulate all the organization and all the students or my colleagues who are involved in organizing almost day by day such special events like that will place today. It's amazing to see this classroom full. You are many than constitutional law class, for example, but it's nice to see such a great interest shown by the students of our faculty, of our university, the former students, today our colleagues, and I hope that you will enjoy this event, because I'm sure that all the speaker and the discussion will be very interesting and something to learn and to remember for the future. So congrats again, and good luck for all.
I'm really, really happy to see this happening. And I also want to say how proud I am of the students of the Lex Hub organization and what they managed to do today. Without their efforts, this wouldn't be possible, this conference, this event. And I'm absolutely convinced that this conference is just the beginning of a broader plan of something that will become a tradition here, a conference that will become a tradition. And I want all of you to give a round of claps for our amazing students at Lex Hub for creating this amazing conference that's actually managed to become in just a few weeks an international conference. And I'm convinced that this is the first step and we will keep going and create more amazing events. So congrats.
It is with great pleasure and a sense of proudness that I welcome you here today. The results that the students from our faculty have achieved in such a short period is simply astonishing. I'm very proud of you all, firstly, because you managed to do something that few can, to have a dream and to chase it and to make it reality. And this is only by result of your efforts, and for this I'm very grateful. And I thank you. Of course, you had a lot of help from the team members of our faculty, who all pitched in and supported this endeavor. And for them, I'm also very grateful, and I hope we will be able to do great things in the future as well. I'm convinced that you will, and I'm convinced that with the help of our staff, we can achieve your dreams that you will have in the future. Also, I'm very grateful for all the speakers that we have here today. It was a pleasure to meet Professor Connolly, and I'm very excited for the lecture that she will be holding in a few moments. And of course, Mr. McNeil and Mrs. Lupashku and Mr. Craiu. There are people that I always wanted to meet, and it is a pleasure to hear them in the following moments. I want to thank also the administrative staff and the rector, the pro-rector, the members of the UMFST University Press, and of course Mr. Professor Sabodin and the head of our faculty for their support. I don't want to keep you waiting any longer. You truly proved that per aspera ad astra is something that is achievable here today, and I thank you.
First of all, just a very big thank you to the student organisers. You guys are phenomenal. So you're really speaking to the spirit of the name of the conference, which I absolutely love. There's no way that I would work in this territory if there was no hope. And a new world order is about things that are fracturing, yes, of course, and we take those very seriously when we're working in the legal space and the social sciences space and in that interdisciplinary space, which you so presciently mentioned. But we also have to have hope in this space, because that's also what a new world order is, right? I don't know if you know much about Irish history. My surname is Connolly, which is an Irish surname. My dad's family are Irish. And one of my favourite poets is a poet called Seamus Heaney. And he wrote a wonderful poem. In one of the lines, he speaks about being in that space between hope and history. And I think as students, you are in that space between hope and history. I think as academics, we're in that space between hope and history. And sometimes we can forget that. Sometimes we can forget that when we're rushing to our deadlines, whether that's our assignments, whether that's our reports, but you are in that space between hope and history. And don't forget that when you're doing your assignments. My students sometimes tear their hair out when I say, please try and enjoy your assignment. And they say, what, are you crazy? I say, well, yeah, of course, you know. But actually, you know, you're actually demonstrating what you're learning, and you're investing in your own future and your assignments. And when you're investing in your future, you're investing in the future of other people, which speaks to law as the language through which humanity writes its future. And that's what you're doing when you're doing your assignments. And that's the professor stuff over there with assignment talk. And Seamus Heaney, when he, you know, you might think actually, you know, you're being very sentimental talking about hope, and it can feel like that sometimes. It's not a, you know, Seamus Heaney, when he was interviewed about what hope means, he said, it isn't a false optimism. I mean, that would just be stupid, right? To be falsely optimistic about things. But actually, it's about knowing that things are worth fighting for. Okay, so be in that space between hope and history. So today I'm going to be talking, so as mentioned, before I go on, actually, I want to say it's so amazing to be here in Târgu Mureș. So everyone that I've met over the past 24 hours is probably fed up of me saying this, but I was here as a teenager in Târgu Mureș, just over 30 years ago. And so it's amazing to be here. It really matters a lot. So when Mihaela asked me if I would come and talk, I jumped at the opportunity. And it's great to be in the company of such distinguished speakers today. I truly feel very humbled. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about children and international humanitarian law. So as mentioned, you know, my work, I've been working in this space now for 15 years or so. A lot of my work has focused on the care and protection of children as they have crossed borders. And in the UK context, I work with unaccompanied children, and separated migrant children. So, you know, the international legal definition of unaccompanied and separated migrant children are those who have crossed borders and who are without their primary caregivers. And, you know, when I first started doing this work, it wasn't really a subject area that people focused on. But certainly the last 10 years or so, there has been an increase of interest, because there has been, and let's not forget this because it's easy to forget this, there has been an increase in humanitarian spirit at the same time as an increase in hostility. And so it goes back to the dialectic, that dialectical space that we have to work in when we're working in human rights. And I've advised the government in the UK on what it needs to do to better protect children from Syria, from Iraq, from Sudan, from various countries, from Ukraine. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of children from different countries. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you some insight into, you know, what is the law, the humanitarian law around children? Because that's often something that's really forgotten. You know, what is the laws that are supposed to protect them before they leave their countries of origin? Because there is a framework to protect children and young people. But as we'll see, and as you no surprise, it's often not implemented. So I'm going to talk through some of those things today. So international humanitarian law is the body of law which deals with armed conflict, essentially, international conflicts and non-international conflicts, state actors, non-state actors, and it's designed to protect civilians, including children, against the harms that can happen, and to put a limit, you know, in law anyway, to put a limit on the effects of armed conflict on civilians, and to establish responsibilities on state and non-state actors. And you might not know it, but there are distinct protections in the international humanitarian law framework specifically for children. You have a number of frameworks which we'll address shortly. I won't go into lots of them because I don't want to get bogged down in technicality, but I want to give you some insight And I want to give you some insight because I want you to think about children in this space, because so often they're forgotten in this space. And the world needs really great international children's rights lawyers to advocate for them. So we're going to think about international humanitarian law frameworks, and then also going to think about there is a specific framework, architecture within the UN system called the CAC, which is the Children and Armed Conflict Framework, which is there to protect children. Some people think, okay, so why are we talking about children? Why are we not talking in general terms? We're talking about children, first of all, because they have distinct rights under international children's rights law. They have rights under humanitarian law. But there's such a significant issue for the UN system itself. And there's such a significant issue because the issue of children and armed conflict, it cuts across the 3 pillars in the United Nations. So there are 3 pillars in the United Nations. There's the peace and security agenda, there's development, and then there's human rights. And often human rights gets forgotten and it is less funded. But the issue of children and armed conflict, it cuts across all these areas. And so it's absolutely vital that we have children at the center so that we can have a broader understanding as well of how the UN system works and also how it doesn't work. Because actually what you'll probably get later on in this presentation is that actually the issue of children and armed conflict within the UN system shows the UN system at its best and at its worst. And so we'll address some of that. And also it's a cross-cutting issue because it also links with international human rights law. I think some of you might be doing public international law. It also links with international criminal law, so issues around the International Criminal Court, which to some of you might feel like it's been there for ages. It feels still very fresh to me as an ancient person. And then also international labor law. And you might think, why international labor law and children in armed conflict? Well, actually, because many children that are experiencing armed conflict, whether that's child combatants, child soldiers, whether they're directly involved in hostilities or not, they experience the most egregious violations around exploitation. Okay, so international labor law as well, believe it or not. So it's a multifaceted area to think about. So you might not have thought about that when you're thinking about children specifically. You might have thought, oh, it's a very distinct area of law, but actually it's one that's very, very important for all these areas. This here is a kind of simulation of, she was a British activist who set up Save the Children, Hellen Connolly. And she said every war is a war against children. And again, children are often rendered invisible in discussions of war, in discussions of peace, in discussions of security, in diplomacy, but they are the ones who are super affected by war. And that much she recognized. She was one of the drafters of the Geneva Declaration on the Rights of the Child, which was a precursor to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. I mean, a significant precursor, because this was in 1924. And in the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, there were 5 principles, and it stated that actually children, after war, they deserve protection and relief. And that was a very, very significant thing to happen. There were subsequent declarations in the 50s, and then the International Convention on the Rights of the Child in the 1980s. But every war is a war against children. And actually Save the Children, they do still a lot of work in areas of international armed conflict and national armed conflict. So when we're thinking about children and the scale of how children are affected by war, I have to caution that this is quite tough to hear. Okay, so we're going to think about some of the statistics. In all my time working in this area, I never get used to talking about this and talking about the scale of children affected by war. I remember one of the one of the kind of impetuses for me doing this work was actually a report which we'll come on to later, back in 2006, by Graça Machel, who was the wife of Nelson Mandela, actually. And in one of her reports to the United Nations, she spoke about 2 million, and this was back in 2006, and things have got worse. You know, we're talking about the New World Order. She spoke about 2 million children dying as a result of war over a 10-year period. 2 million. Today, we have escalations of crisis. We're living through intersectional crisis, right? So we're living through conflict, we're living through climate change, we're living through rising dangerous politics. And so this is a serious situation. 473 million children in 2024 were affected by and living around situations of armed conflict. These are absolutely staggering numbers, which we have to take seriously. We can't leave children out of the international law space or the international humanitarian law space. In Gaza, for example, 20,000 children have been killed in 24 months alone. That's an estimate by Save the Children. It's probably much higher than that. There was a study by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine that said actually the casualties and the mortality rates in Gaza would probably be about 41% higher because of the after effects of what was happening. This is very serious indeed. The situation in Syria. Yes, conflict has allegedly stopped. There have been escalations since. 30,000 children killed in Syria. In Sudan, I don't know if you've seen recently what's been happening in Sudan. Long-standing conflict, genocide in Sudan. There has been the siege of Al-Fashir. 130,000 children trapped in Al-Fashir. Ukraine, we have speakers here talking about Ukraine today. 1.5 million children displaced by conflict, thousands of children dead, and numbers of children abducted. And we're going to talk about that today because actually this is an issue that the international community needs to take very seriously, the abduction of children across borders from Ukraine into Russia. Over and above the numbers, so this is the highest numbers since the Second World War, there is, as we'll see, there is supposed to be a framework to protect children and young people. Sometimes we have this false distinction between children and young people, but someone doesn't stop being a child, someone doesn't stop needing protection the day they turn 18, right? So they still need protection, so there should also be a focus on children and youth. So we need to take this seriously because we have a framework there, but the framework is not working, it's not being implemented. So many children, this is an issue for their development. So not only is it causing fatalities, poor health, but also there is a right to development in international law. In children's law, there's a right to life, survival, and development. And often in crisis and emergencies, we're thinking about survival, okay? And that's absolutely essential. But we also have to think about development and livelihood. It's a fundamental part of children's rights. So it's creating a development gap and a livelihoods gap. It's a critical issue for peace and security in the future for the obvious reasons that children are the future. Okay, children and young people are the future. So if you have children living their whole childhood through protracted conflict, what are the possibilities for the future? What are the possibilities for communities and hope in communities and countries? On a positive note, which is really important, right? Okay, so let's bring it to the positive, because this can get quite heavy, and I'm very sorry, but this is the reality, right? When you're working in the space, you're working in that kind of dialectical space between the hope and the history, between the facts and the future. There's a really wonderful organization called Geneva Call, and I would really encourage you to look them up. So they work, actually, they work in with militant groups, actually, to try and inform them. Some of them know, many of them know, but to try and work with them to try and implement humanitarian law on the ground. And they work with them across a number of areas, and one of them is around children, peace and security. And one of the things that they found is that actually the issue of children is the thing that's likely to get them to sign declarations of interest, right? And to get them to change their practices from command all the way down. And so when you're working on issues of children and armed conflict and children, peace and security, it's not just that they're the hope for the future, but they're also the hope in the present, in that negotiating space. Because which armed guy wants to think of their own child perishing? So there's hope in that space, and they do a lot of really good work across multiple contexts. And we're one of the few organizations that were allowed to stay in Afghanistan most recently, because they are known by different armed groups for doing this really important work. And it's fundamentally a credibility issue for the United Nations. So we have this framework, but why is there this implementation gap? So it's not that children are peripheral or an add-on, but they're absolutely central for the humanitarian law agenda and for the agenda of peace and security. In order to understand how legal frameworks work, and that's true when you're working with migrant children in national contexts, in receiving countries, and that's true when you're thinking about their rights in the international space. What does childhood mean? So, have you heard of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child? Yeah? So there's this United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and they established the gold standard of childhood at 18. So when I'm talking today about children, I'm talking about under 18. But this shifts a lot, so when you're a scholar, when you're studying law, whether that's in national context, whether that's in international context, you can see this shift in terms of how childhood is constructed. And that's really important when you're looking at international humanitarian law. So, for example, there's moral discrepancies around child soldiers. So in international law, it had been previously that, and that's quite complicated, so we'll get into that in a second, that the age was set at 15 for a child soldier. So whilst you have this gold standard here, at just under 18, in other parts, it was 15. In the optional protocol for children involved in armed conflict, which is an add-on, if you like, an important add-on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, they increase it from 15 to say, actually, it should be 18. So you can see how childhood is being differently constructed across time and also across place. Also, if we're thinking of childhood at below 18, what does it mean when a child commits a crime? Okay, so we have these discussions in national context. So in the UK, the age of criminal responsibility is actually 10, which is very low. I think it's the lowest in the European context, which, in my line of work in terms of migration is really significant, because then potentially children can be punished for what is so-called migration crime, which is actually in reality just a child trying to get to safety in another country. And we see this also in the international space as well, where there are dilemmas around How do we understand childhood, and also how do we understand childhood agency? If you set the age at under 18 for children who are competent, then debates arise around, well, doesn't a child have agency at 16 or 17? And how do we deal with this balance between someone being a victim in armed conflict and becoming a child soldier, and someone being a perpetrator? Now, I'm squarely in where the law has been going in this, that actually children are victims. But this is stuff that the international legal space has had to thrash out. The Sierra Leone Tribunal was one such tribunal in international humanitarian law that really grappled with this issue. So there was a horrendous civil war. I won't go into that in great detail. In Sierra Leone, in the 90s, there was a trial. So there was an ad hoc tribunal that was set up afterwards to hold perpetrators accountable. Command and control perpetrators, but there were between 15,000 and 30,000, 33,000 children in Sierra Leone who had been child soldiers. So what do you do with them? Do you hold them accountable? When the tribunal was set up, the jurisdiction of the tribunal was to hold those with the greatest responsibility accountable. So international NGOs argued that actually you can't say that a child, someone under 18, can bear the greatest responsibility for these crimes. And then you had government in Sierra Leone saying, actually, one of the main reasons that we can't move on is because children who are then growing into adulthood have committed the most heinous atrocities. And I won't speak about them here because, you know, you can go away and read about them, and I don't want to say what some of those were. So this was really thrashed out in this space, and it was an important debate for children in international armed conflict and national armed conflict. So this is a very dynamic area of law, and I have to say the tribunal, they made the right call. Even though the Secretary General of the UN said actually this poses a real moral dilemma for us, for the international community in terms of how children are held account, in the end David Craig, who was the prosecutor, said, okay, we're not gonna try people under 18. So this is a very dynamic area of law precisely because it intersects with how childhoods are constructed and how we change notions of childhood over time. Jeffrey Robertson, who was the prosecutor in the Norman case in the tribunal, captured this very well. And he said, children are a very recent subject of human rights. So you can see that even in the issue of how child soldiers have been constructed. They're a very recent subject of human rights, omitted from 18th century declarations on the rights of man, because they were then regarded as property of their parents. The League of Nations, moved by the numbers of children orphaned in the First World War, issued a declaration in 1924 about the duties of governments to provide food, shelter, medical attention for poor children. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says no more than that motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights vaguely gives protection to children as part of the family and affords them just one right to acquire a nationality. So he's saying this has moved on over time, and this is largely in part to do with how we construct children and childhoods. So what are the key frameworks that offer children protection in terms of international and national armed conflict? So you have the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols. In particular, you have the Fourth Geneva Convention from 1949, and then you have these additional protocols in 1977, AP1 and AP2, dealing with national and international conflict. As I've mentioned before, you have then the development of the CAC agenda in the UN Security Council. You have the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the OPAC, which is the optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflicts. The Rome Statute, not the Roman Statute, if you're studying international law, but the Rome Statute, I always have to circle my students' work. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court is also hugely relevant, because actually we need to hold perpetrators to account, and obviously the International Criminal Court does that. I mentioned earlier that the issue of child soldiers, for example, the issues of exploitation that happen in armed conflict, is an issue of the worst form of labor. So you have the ILO Convention 182 being super relevant. I don't know if any of you are following the Connolly case in the International Criminal Court, but some of the things that children experienced during the civil war in Uganda, as child soldiers directly involved in hostilities and indirectly, have been really significant there. Girls forced to sexual violence to produce children to then fight, and that is an issue of modern slavery. Okay, so the worst form, the conventional worst form of labor is absolutely vital. And then you have regional instruments as well, such as the African Union Charter on the rights and welfare of children, which I have to say was absolutely fundamental to kind of increasing people's expectations for protection of children under 18 in armed conflict, particularly those who had been child soldiers. And then, of course, you have your lawyers. You know that there's case law. There's been significant case laws in various international tribunals, which has focused on children. I know some of you have studied with Mihaela and studied issues around Bosnia and the genocide in Bosnia and Srebrenica. There was a very famous case, the Kurac case, which looked at crimes committed against children as issuing aggravated sentences. So whilst it wasn't seen as a distinct crime in itself, because the crimes had been committed against children, there was a harsher sentence given. Those crimes were, in that case, were crimes against girls, as well as young women, and those resulted in aggravated sentences for the perpetrators. So you have general protections in the Geneva Convention, which are for all civilians. And I hope those of you that are listening want to study international humanitarian law after this. I'd highly, highly recommend it. So you have a number of protections general protections for everyone, which are also important for children. So you have the right to life. You have the prohibition of coercion, torture, corporal punishment, collective punishment, which has become a significant issue recently. Prohibition of attacks against civilians, and then the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. And that's really important, because one of the things that has been happening a lot in modern warfare is that actually it's civilians that are caught up in this. It's 90% of people that are killed in war are civilians. So this is super important. And then if you think about 40-50% of those are children, then these are absolutely relevant. These are from Articles 27 to 34 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. It's difficult to say. You said English was difficult to speak. Is difficult when you're speaking all these international frameworks. I much prefer the additional protocols. They're easier to say, and also they're more contemporary as well. But these are the general articles here. And then you have ones that are particular for children in the Geneva Convention. So in the 1949 Convention and in the additional protocols, you have special protections for children. It establishes in the 49 Convention, the Fourth Convention, that children should be given special care. Attention should be given by the military to the consequences that their actions are having on children. And that actually there should be a welfare framework around them, and that's established as far back as 1949. Of course, that establishment was born from great suffering, and the suffering of the Holocaust and the Second World War. And in Article 50 of that convention as well, it establishes that there should be there should be appropriate institutions for those children affected by war. I meant to mention that in the other article there that I just spoke about, that actually there also is protections there for children who have been separated by their parents, either by the result of the war, from migration, or as a result of being orphaned. So, really important, because actually international humanitarian law is about establishing criminal activities in war. And so when you have children in these frameworks, what it's saying is, you know, there is the international criminalization of offenses against children. And this is established as far back as the Fourth Geneva Convention. So what are some of those extra protections? What are those special protections? So you have, you know, children should not be evacuated. They should only be moved from their areas of origin, where from their communities. Areas of origin is quite legal term. They should only be removed from their areas of origin when there are good reasons to do that. So reasons around their health, medical treatment of children, and when it's in their safety, essentially. Family unity is a huge principle in international humanitarian law, because the family is, more often than not, I mean not always, is a unit of protection. So it's really important that children aren't separated. And in humanitarian law, the principle of family unity is absolutely central. So they shouldn't be separated from their parents or their primary caregivers if they don't have parents. And family reunification is an absolute must. It should be a top priority in situations where children are separated. I think, you know, going back to, I don't know if it's the case in Romania, certainly in the UK, I know we're not talking about situations of armed conflict in the UK, but certainly in relation to migrant children, the issue of family reunification has become very politicized, where migrant children are seen as anchor children, are seen as instrumental children being sent to the UK so their parents can join them. But actually, it's a principle in international law, in international human rights law, as well as in international humanitarian law. I'll never forget, a few years ago, I was doing a piece of work for Amnesty International and Save the Children, and it was on family reunification. And I remember hearing this story about a kid in Syria. And basically, he was living in an area in Syria that ISIS, Daesh were there. And the family and the whole village, they had to flee. And they had to flee really quickly because they heard that they were coming to the village. And the young boy had his pajamas on, and they all fled, and the family got into one truck, and he got into another, and he just literally had his pajamas. He then ended up in the UK and didn't know where his family were, whether they were still alive, if they were in another country, and he'd experienced multiple abuses on the way to the UK. So the principle of family unity is absolutely central for protection. We've mentioned the prohibition of the use of children in armed conflict. The additional protocols that I mentioned from 1977, they give much more protection. They talk about direct hostilities as well as indirect hostilities, because children can be used in armed conflict for, yes, direct hostilities, but also as cooks, you know, as spies, a whole host of ways. And they're still child soldiers, even though they're not taking part directly in hostilities. And children should be given special treatment as children. They should be seen as victims first. Detention, this has become a really significant issue that many organizations are very worried about just now, and this is a kind of the securitization, I guess, of conflict, where different groups are being deemed as terrorist groups, and that's having a consequence on how children are being treated in those contexts. And we're seeing an increase, certainly, over the last 10 years or so of children being detained. And so that securitization of armed conflict is really important to consider. But there are special protections in the Geneva Conventions around childhoods and detention. Yeah, I wanted to, because we can get very theoretical, can't we, about the frameworks, and I am a legal geek, so I love all the international frameworks, but it's, we have to also apply them, right? I want to see an example of evacuation and a breach of the Geneva Conventions for children is the issue of the evacuation of Ukrainian children across borders and into Russia. And I don't know if our subsequent speaker is going to speak about this, but on the 17th of March 2023, the International Criminal Court issued 2 warrants of arrest for Russian state officials. President Putin, who you all know, and also who you might not know, and which might take you by surprise, is the Children's Commissioner in Russia, Children's Commissioner, Pavlova, for the unlawful transfer of children from the temporarily occupied areas of Ukraine to the territories of the Russian Federation. This is under Article 2A and Article 82B, etc., of the Rome Statute, reflecting the Geneva Convention on War Crimes. Forgive me, that should be a 2, sorry, not 2022. And this is not controversial. This is actually happening. What is difficult to know is the numbers, right? Because, as I spoke earlier about the social construction of childhood, and part of that is also that childhood is politicized. And we see this in the numbers, certainly, that are circulating from the Russian side, for sure. But as an issue, it's been highlighted, obviously referred to the International Criminal Court and highlighted in a number of UN reports, including the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. It references the Geneva Convention in its report. So really important to know these, to be literate around these conventions if you are reading these documents, because it's much easier to understand how things are being framed. I said there's significant variations in the estimates. So this is, I took this from a Westminster parliamentary debate, so a debate in the UK Parliament where this is being seen as a very, very serious issue. Sorry for being very UK-centric there. I'm not UK-centric. I don't think the whole world is the UK, honestly. But the numbers, a really interesting report there, which says actually anything from just under 20,000, and then some Russian sources saying 700,000 from across, from Ukraine into Russia, and actually how those children are being dispersed across vast areas of the Russian Federation, across 8 different time zones, apparently. Now, this is a crime. This is a war crime. This is a crime against children. This is totally unacceptable. I would say it's genocide. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Genocide Convention. Most people are familiar with some parts of that convention, which is the physical destruction in whole or in part of a group. Scroll down into some other part of that convention, and the transfer of children is in that convention as constituting genocide. And actually, the man that coined the word genocide is Lemkin, Raphael Lemkin, and he wanted this to be more at the fore, actually. But subsequent drafters, I don't think, focused enough on this, which means we're now kind of grappling so many years later on getting this determined to be the crime of genocide. There's a lot of really important academic articles being written about this. I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to read them, but certainly it fits it fits that definition and is really important to think about. Of course, genocide is a mass atrocity, which is relevant in terms of understanding international humanitarian law. Would you have thought that the transfer of children would constitute genocide? I'd encourage you to think about that, because if you think about it, it's about the physical destruction of a group, removing children from families, removing children from communities. But it's also about that cultural aspect of genocide, which again, I don't think has been developed enough in terms of international law, in terms of academic scholarship, but destroying culture, relationships, communities. So it's really important to think about, and whether the numbers are 19,546, 700,000, they are significant, very significant. That's a huge number of children, and many of whom we don't know where they are. Children in state residential care have been particularly vulnerable, and of course the arguments, the manipulated arguments from the Russian side, that actually this is for health. You know, sometimes you see it kind of turning around of humanitarian law by people who are violating the law, so they're using the law to justify their illegality. This is very, very significant indeed, and I hope more countries are pushing this as an agenda. Here's a quote from the report I mentioned from the UK Parliament. Margarita was 10 months old, a baby, when she was taken from a children's home in Kherson. She could not walk or talk, but she was already a target of the Russian regime. She was taken to Moscow on the excuse that she needed medical care, so that's subversion of the international humanitarian law frameworks, but she didn't. She ended up in the arms of a senior Russian politician. Why is that important? Senior Russian politician, accountability, and a close ally of President Putin. He adopted her, changed her name, changed her birthplace, and registered her as his daughter. That baby girl, just months old, had her whole identity rewritten and erased. She's now legally Russian, and the truth is buried. That is not care, it's abduction in the uniform of bureaucracy. This isn't the first time this has happened in history. I don't know if you know about the Armenian genocide, but this also happened in the Armenian genocide, and very significant for scholars to think more about. So in the UN system, we have, as I mentioned earlier, the CAC agenda. So this is a UN initiative, a whole architecture around the protection of children in armed conflict that seeks to prevent and respond to grave violations against children in armed conflict, promote accountability, absolutely important, because at the moment we have this huge impunity gap. So to promote accountability and integrate child protection into peace and security efforts, and that's absolutely vital. For a number of reasons, but early on I mentioned that actually children are the future, therefore absolutely vital to have them integrated into the peace and security agenda of the United Nations system. This was a really important example. The evolution of the CAC agenda is a really good example. I saw this phrase in an article about the CAC agenda, actually, which spoke about norm entrepreneurship. That's also difficult to say. So being creative with the law, right? So, you know, law isn't just about reading what the Geneva Conventions are, reading what the Convention on the Rights of the Child is. It's actually thinking, okay, we have agency around the law. How do we use it? And certainly this is the position that the UN were in when the CAC agenda was being developed. So a really good example of norm emergence and entrepreneurship. I have a Scottish accent. In Scotland, in some parts of Scotland, we can't pronounce our R's properly. I really struggle with that. I'm from Edinburgh, and I can't say entrepreneurship properly. What is the CAC agenda? So the CAC agenda is a body of framework and tools. So things to implement the framework. So you've got frameworks and you've got tools. UN resolutions and policies, primarily under the responsibility of the Security Council, but also with diffuse responsibility across other UN agencies, but also NGOs as well. It has its origins in the 1990s, and the mass atrocities through civil wars that children were exposed to. We've mentioned Bosnia earlier, also Rwanda, Haiti, Sudan, Somalia, Sierra Leone, already mentioned. And the CAC agenda was really initiated by the newly formed Committee on the Rights of the Child. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was only brought into being at the end of the 1980s, in 1989. Okay, before you were probably all born, but not that much, we take these things for granted. So the newly formed Committee on the Rights of the Child in the 1990s said we need to have something in this system that protects children. We've had all these wars. We've had all these children having to live their lives through war, and this is not okay. So the UN, they commissioned a study by Grasser Michel, who I mentioned, to look at, okay, what is the impact of war in the lives of children? And to develop a set of recommendations for the UN to bring into action. So in 1996, she released her report, which highlighted the physical, psychological, and social impacts of war on children, but also childhoods. And there is a distinction, talk about children and individual children, and childhoods, we're talking about it in the collective. In response to that report, there was a new office, a new role established in the United Nations Security Council, the special representative to the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict. And it was their responsibility to ensure that the rights of children, the protection of children, the well-being of children through armed conflict would not again be rendered invisible by the international community. In 1999, the Security Council issued their first resolution on children and armed conflict, Resolution 1261. Just to give you an example of why this was important, do many of you know about what happened in Rwanda? So in Rwanda in 1994, there was genocide against the Tutsis, which led to systematic destruction and the loss of lives on such a significant scale. Again, it's really difficult to talk about numbers, but it's also really important to talk about numbers because it gives us a sense of why we have to keep this agenda at the center. Anywhere between 800, the reports say anywhere between 800,000 and 2 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus in Rwanda were victims of the genocide. 75% of ethnic Tutsis were killed and systematically targeted and killed. So many children were orphaned as a result of that. There were already issues in Rwanda with orphaned children as a result of HIV. After the genocide, there were 1.4 million orphaned children in Rwanda, reflecting the dual pathways of the genocide as well as the situation of HIV in the country. And there was just such a significant breakdown of any safety net for them. Then there was also the situation in Bosnia. Hands up if you've taken any classes on Bosnia. Did any of you hear Nejad Avdic speak here? Was it last year? Yeah. This year? This year. I thought some of you might have heard Nejad's story. So Nejad was so I've got another story on the slide, but I'll introduce Nejad for a minute. Nejad was a 17-year-old boy in Srebrenica and was left for dead by the Bosnian Serb army. He miraculously survived, and he became a key witness in the tribunal in Yugoslavia. Actually was who was actually cross-examined by Milosevic himself, in response to his, Nejad was there testifying about his horrific experiences. I thought some of you may have already heard Nejad's story, so I thought I would give another example of someone called Faroudin, who was a very young boy during the genocide in Srebrenica. He was 7 years old in 1995 when it happened. He'd already lost his mother at the start of the genocidal war and was living with his father. One day in 1995, the Bosnian Serb army, they came to the village, and the uncle took the younger sister. He was too little to run himself, and he was too big to carry. So his father said, "Hide under the bed." And they came in, and they caught the father, and they caught Faroudin. And they took them to a site. He saw everything that happened. He was left, he himself at 7 was shot. And he was rescued by a soldier who saved his life and took him to hospital. This is the reality of children's experiences of armed conflict, children's experiences of genocide. Faroudin also became a witness in the International Tribunal for the former Republic of Yugoslavia. Why am I telling you this story? I'm not telling you this story to make you feel bad. I'm not telling you this story for any voyeuristic reason. It's hard to hear. But also, in the previous slide, we were speaking about numbers. And in this slide, we're speaking about individual lives and how lives are affected afterwards. Grassa Michel, who I mentioned earlier, who did that really important study for the United Nations, which then created the impetus for the CAC agenda, talks about children as unifiers and as constellations of hope, essentially. I used the word constellations because I like that word. I think you're all constellations of hope, studying law, right? Sitting here today, you're saying, I want to be here, I want to be counted, I want to make a change, I want to have agency around hope. Children can help, she says, in a world of diversity and disparity. Children are a unifying force capable of bringing people to common ethical grounds. And what is law? I mean, sometimes we could, maybe I can come back and do another session on this. But, in ideal terms, law is common ethical ground, right? In ideal terms, common ethical grounds. So children are common ethical grounds. Children's needs and aspirations cut across all ideologies and culture. The needs of all children are the same: nutritious food, adequate health care, a decent education, shelter, and a secure and loving family. Children are both our reason to struggle to eliminate the worst aspects of warfare and our best hope for succeeding at it. And this is true. This is why this is an important thing to talk about. This is why this is an important thing to keep on the agenda. So earlier I mentioned the first resolution, 1999, for the CAC agenda. And then in 2001, there was another resolution, 1379, which called on the UN Secretary General to include those parties recruiting and using children, so recruitment and use, in a yearly report to the Security Council. So every year, I don't know if any of you I've been on the UN's website. I think it's a great resource. There's lots of stuff there. It can be quite overwhelming, but there is an annual report every year by the Secretary General on the situation of children and armed conflict. And in 2001, the Secretary General was asked to basically name and shame those parties to armed conflict who are violating the rights of children. in relation to violations of humanitarian law. They call it the list of shame, right? They call it the list of shame. And you can see that in the appendix of these annual reports. You see the groups that are named by the Security Council. And actually, it's called the list of shame. There's a stigma for being on that list. So listed parties, and that's been really important. There's been some real changes made in terms of naming parties, because you name parties, then they have to then work with the Security Council to develop action plans to basically be better behaved and to make sure that they're adhering to the international humanitarian law for children. So the list of shame. And then you also have a Security Council working group on children and on conflict. And then there's also been a number of thematic resolutions since then. I don't want to mention all of them. The most recent one was last year on peacekeeping missions, I think. Then one of the things that you get in 2010 is the UN Security Council, the UN Secretary General was asked to show their methodology for what counts for including and excluding groups from this list of shame. And what they said was actually there needs to be a pattern of violations, so not just one-off. So there has to be a methodical plan, there has to be that intentionality demonstrated, that willfulness demonstrated. In the CAC agenda, there are 6 grave violations against children, which reflect violations in international humanitarian law, recruitment and use, killing and maiming of children, sexual violence, abduction, attacks on schools and hospitals, and denial of humanitarian access. In the first few years, the reports by the Secretary General were just on recruitment and use, but over the years, they've included the other violations in there too. Because the law is always evolving, if you remember, I think it was on the second slide, I spoke about being a dynamic area of law. It may be that these violations are added to, I hope so, because children's rights are violated in so many ways over and above all of these, but these are the 6 grave violations against children, and they very much reflect what's in international humanitarian law. Since 2005, and we're now in, what are we in, 2025, there's 10 countries that have remained consistently on that list. 10 countries. So whilst there's been some good steps made, also we need to do better. We absolutely need to do better on this. This is a quote here from research that I did. I'm going to talk about what people say about the challenges and successes of the CAC agenda, but what I wanted to do first of all, because I'm an expert in children's rights, is actually mention the voice of a child. So this is a young person I worked with from Afghanistan, saying Afghanistan is one of the ones that's always been on the list since 2005, saying, it's so dangerous, life is not there to live, it's like animals. You can't go to school, you have to go from one city, changing city to city. Afghanistan's not a country, I don't think. In my home country, you feel that every day you're going to die, every day you feel that today is the day you're going to be killed. And I guess one of the things I guess that perplexes me is that we have an international children's rights framework. The principle of participation and voice is in that framework, and yet we haven't found a way to include children and young people in the UN Security Council system, to bring their voices in, and I think we need to do much more on that. There are other voices on the next slide, which talk about the successes and challenges, but certainly from a child's perspective, if you've been living through conflict, it's sometimes very difficult to see what that innovative system is actually achieving on the ground. Some of the successes, though, is that when a country is on the, when actors rather, not a country, when actors are on the list of shame, they have to work with the Security Council to have an action plan. And people hail that as quite a significant success. The literature, representatives from the UN system, those working in international NGOs, talk about how they've actually resulted, and this is really good, how they've resulted in approximately 200,000 child soldiers being released from armed groups and forces. So that is really important, 200,000. And there have been 38 action plans signed and 12 parties who have fully delivered. So some armed groups have come off the list. In Sri Lanka, in Nepal, Uganda, I think Chad. Anyway, a number of them have come off the list. But actually, you know, earlier on the slide, at the start of the presentation, I spoke about how this is a really significant issue for the UN in terms of its credibility. There has been increasing concerns that these lists have become quite politicized. So back in 2016, I think the UN Secretary General at the time was Ban Ki-moon, and who was it? There was a Saudi Arabia was on the list. Some actors in Saudi Arabia, and there was a lot of pressure put on the Security Council to remove them. And they threatened with pulling some funding from the UN system. So they were then removed from the list. A massive credibility issue for the UN. Subsequent Secretary General tried to stand their ground, and actually didn't in the end. And what we see now in the lists are a splitting of the lists, where you have the list of shame, and then you have a list around actors that are taking positive steps, right? So what does that really mean? You know, and that's prompted a lot of people who've been involved in this system to really say, we need to do much better, and this is a really significant credibility issue if you can get your name pulled just for threatening to withdraw funding. And then also, who makes these decisions? What is the basis of these decisions for positive measures? What does that actually mean? And so this is a really significant credibility issue for the Security Council, 100%, absolutely. And what does it also mean when you have, you've heard of the big five in the Security Council? What does it mean if one of the big fives, like Russia, is actually violating the rights by occupying parts of Ukraine, by abducting children, by killing children in Syria, by killing children across Ukraine? What does it mean if they are still on the Security Council as one of the 5 main countries on the Security Council who has the power to veto? So we're really at a crossroads here. Some really eminent people, in fact, they have looked at the decisions that have been made for the listing and delisting of certain actors. And they've done a systematic review looking at the inconsistencies. So the Security Council needs to do much better on this if it's going to be credible. I mentioned earlier, really significant issue is the securitization of armed conflict and the securitization of childhoods where children are detained for association with certain armed groups, and sometimes that association is very tenuous. I was reading a report from Human Rights Watch a few years ago, and child, I think it was in Nigeria, was detained for selling a yam to people from Boko Haram. And so this is a really significant issue in terms of getting to grips with international humanitarian law standards for children and young people. That's a quote there just from my research of a young person who was caught up in that securitization stuff. I have other examples here of where violations have happened, such as in the occupied Palestinian territories, where you have children detained for resisting occupation. So I don't know if you've seen pictures of stone throwing, but certainly in the last 20 years, there's been an estimated 10,000 Palestinian children held in Israeli military detention. The opinions of the International Court of Justice show that actually those are illegal, and Israel's the only country in the world that prosecutes children in military courts. I want to end on a positive. So, what is the positive? Because there are, right? So even though, I mean, you know, I'm social scientists, you're lawyers, we need to engage critically with the situation, right? So we need to be able to see what's happening and what isn't happening and be informed, right? But I think there's a really great initiative that's happened in the UN. I don't know if you've heard of it. I love it. And it's called the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda. And basically it puts young people at the heart of initiating peace in communities and in the world. My hope, going back to constructions of childhood, is that we have a childhood peace, children, peace and security agenda, which recognizes children's agency and children's capacity for solutions. And on that note, I want to just go to the last slide, which shows you some of that hope. Again, going back to Bosnia, because I work a lot in Bosnia, there's the War Childhood Museum, which is a great example of memory activism, with memory being seen as an important facet of truth and justice and healing. And so I guess my invitation, and I've contrasted that here with this picture of a boy and his head being tussled by Mladic, who was one of the key perpetrators of the Srebrenica genocide. Go and be innovators. Go and be norm entrepreneurs. Go out and shape your legal profession. Whether you decide to do that on childhood, but we need great scholars, we need great legal academics to go and be shaping this agenda. And I guess this is why I come and talk to you and talk to other students, to give you that invitation to go out and, what's the phrase? See law as the language through which humanity writes its future, and an invitation for you to see children and the law differently, and an opportunity for the future. Okay, thank you.